That's right, indeed we are. But first, we want to get to that breaking news. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden naming California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. Biden's campaign website now reading Biden-Harris at the top with a picture of the two front and center. In his announcement on Twitter, Biden called Harris, quote, a fearless fighter for the little guy and one of the country's finest public servants. Dr. Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas, is joining us live to weigh in on the pick. Good afternoon to you, Jim.
Good to be here, Ashley. Thanks for having me.
You know, a lot of people are focusing on the historical significance of having a black woman as a running mate, and it is historic. We cannot deny that. But there were a lot of qualified women Biden could have selected. So what do you think his selection of Senator Harris really says about the direction of this campaign?
Well, in some ways, as you point out, as historic as it was, it's also a very safe pick. Senator Harris was vetted during the presidential primary campaign. And while, again, she's a historic pick as an African-American woman, she's also somebody who is identified really the center of the political spectrum within the Democratic Party and has a very mainstream background as a prosecutor and attorney general. So in that sense, it's very much a classic vice presidential pick in that she's somebody that has some national name recognition, has been on a national stage, and can be expected to play the traditional role of the vice presidential candidate as an aggressive defender of the ticket based on what we've seen of her so far.
Do you think that any of the conflicts that they had when they were both running for president, you know, on the issues will present itself during, you know, now this campaign of them running together?
Well, I think it will almost certainly present itself or be presented by the other ticket and by Republican opponents. I think it's probably started already. But I think you don't really launch a campaign like this and you don't adopt a vice presidential candidate, at least under normal circumstances, without working those issues out before. We've seen conflicts erupt in the past. For example, on the McCain-Palin ticket in 2008. But I think Sarah Palin's much more of an outlier than Kamala Harris is. She's much more of a mainstream candidate and much more, I think, vetted in a lot of ways and experienced. And I wouldn't expect this to be brought up other than by opponents of the ticket.
Yeah, you know, obviously because she is so mainstream, she has a voting record, and that means that there's already going to be a lot of criticism. In fact, the Republican National Committee immediately put out a statement reading in part, quote, Harris's extreme positions from raising taxes to abolishing private health insurance to comparing law enforcement officials to the KKK show that the left-wing mob is controlling Biden's candidacy. Do you think there's any legitimacy to their argument, you know, their criticisms of Harris?
You know, I think that's all boilerplate that's just consistent with the messaging we've already seen from the Republican ticket. I mean, they're portraying somebody who's, you know, pretty moderate in his sensibility, and Joe Biden that same way. This is clearly what the playbook is going to be for the national election, particularly from President Trump and his ticket, which is to portray the Democrats as out of the mainstream. So I'm not surprised by that messaging, and I don't think you're going to see anybody's mind changed by any of that messaging. And just like from another perspective, it's unlikely that Kamala Harris is going to change anybody's mind or, you know, cause a lot of people to give Joe Biden a second thought that weren't considering him already. Again, this is a pretty clear mainstream candidate who I think is not going to shake this race up at all, but it was picked to be play a solid, reliable role in the campaign.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing your insight with us today, Dr. Henson. We appreciate it.
As always, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, Ashley.